Hey guys, our Sunday night Bible drill is always something that encourages and helps me, and I wanted to give the opportunity for those Bible drills to be available to you online. I miss getting to be up front with all of our young guys and gals and getting to go over some Bible topics, and so maybe moms and dads from the comforts of home will be able to put these to good use until we're able to come back together again, or even after we're back together again, still make use of these in the home. The first Bible drill that we want to cover is the one that really kind of encompasses everything that we study and talk about together, and that is about the Bible and about the story of the Bible. Let's remind ourselves of just some facts and figures about the Bible. That first of all, the Bible is 66 books. There's 39 books in the Old Testament from Genesis to Malachi, and 27 books in the New Testament from Matthew to Revelation. Put it all together, 66 books in total. However, these 66 books were not just written by one specific author. No, these books were actually put together by 40 different authors. God used a number of different people in the writing of the Bible, and those people were varied in their backgrounds and in where they lived and the languages that they spoke. Specifically, these people lived in different places. They lived in different locations. 3 different continents the Bible was written upon. On top of that, it was written in 3 different languages: Hebrew, Greek, and there's some Aramaic in there as well. On top of that, the Bible was written over the span of a long time, 1,500 years or so. All of these writings came together to be one complete story, the story of the Bible. It is the story of God bringing about salvation to the world. And that's why Psalm 119, verse 160 is so important, where the psalmist says, "The sum of your word is truth." The word sum just means the total. All of your word is truth. And that tells us that we need to take all of the Bible together so that we can get the complete story. And that's what we've tried to do in this particular Bible drill as we talk about the timeline of the Bible. You guys will remember there's 17 steps in this timeline of the Bible. Let's walk through them and talk about what they mean, and then I'll give you the chance at the end to see if you can piece it all together by yourselves. First of all, the Bible begins with the story of creation. God created the heavens and the earth and everything that's in them in 6 days, and then of course on the 7th day He rested. After the story of creation, we read about God deciding to destroy the world by flood. He was going to start all over because He saw the sin was so great in the earth. All of the animals that were on board the ark, they were saved. And then, of course, one family, Noah, him and his family, 8 people in all, they were saved through that time, and God was going to start all over. The next major event we read about in the Bible is about the story of the Tower of Babel. People were all congregated in one location after those centuries of time after Noah's day, and they were all living in one place, speaking one language, trying to build a big giant tower that reached up into the heavens. And God said, "No, that's not what I wanted. I wanted you to go and fill the whole earth and be fruitful and multiply. Don't just be here in this one place." And so God scattered the people, separated them out, and confused their languages. That then gives way to these stories of what we call the patriarchs. We read first of all about Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation. He had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob, of course, had several sons, 12 sons in all, and their stories are recorded in those latter chapters of the book of Genesis. And in fact, these first 4 steps, that all comprises the book of Genesis. Well, what comes after Genesis? Well, of course, what comes after Genesis is the Exodus. Well, what is the Exodus? Well, the Exodus is the story of those Jewish people, the Israelite people, exodusing or exiting. Remember that exit sign? They're exiting from Egypt to this promised land that God had promised for them. Moses would lead them out to that place. Unfortunately, they griped and they complained and they moaned and sinned against God, and God said, your punishment for that is that for 40 years you're going to wander in the wilderness until that generation was gone, and then those who remain, they would then have the opportunity to go into the promised land. And that is the next step, because after those 40 years ended, the conquest of the land needed to take place. The Israelites needed to go in under the leadership of Joshua and take over all of those cities and territories in the promised land, in Canaan. Probably the most famous of those stories would be about the taking over of the city of Jericho and how the walls came tumbling down and God helped them to take the land. After Joshua died, though, the children of Israel began a different kind of leadership. They were led by judges. There were several of those judges. Here's just a few that we probably are very familiar with: Samson, Gideon, Jephthah, Deborah, and a host of others. That was not a good time during Israel's history because they constantly would get into sin and they'd come running back to God. They'd get into sin and they'd come running back to God, and that just happened over and over and over again until God finally gave them a king. It's what they had always wanted, just like the nations around them. God would give them a king. Well, if you're going to have a king, then what does that mean? Well, that means that you have to have a kingdom. And so we read about the united kingdom under the leadership of Saul, first of all. David then was the next king. Solomon was the king after him. But after Solomon, that's when things started to grow off track. And what happened then is that united kingdom became divided. Now we've got two separate kingdoms. We've got the northern tribes, the kingdom of Israel, and then we've got the southern tribes, the kingdom of Judah. Now, that northern set, the kingdom of Israel, had all bad kings, all of them. Every single one of them were awful and rotten, and God gave them over into Assyrian captivity. They were gone. What that means is that left only the kingdom of Judah. The kingdom of Judah had kind of a mix of good and bad kings. Still, most of them were bad, so God spared them a little bit longer. But after a time, even then, God's patience wore thin, and so He gave them over into the Babylonian captivity. And they were taken off to be captives in this strange land called Babylon. It didn't last forever. In fact, God said after 70 years, He was going to allow them the chance to return home. So after 70 years, we read of the return from captivity. And that is when the Israelites, the remaining ones, were allowed to come back to Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and come back to life as normal. Now, these first 13 steps, this all composes the Old Testament. Well, what's after the Old Testament? Well, what happens after the Old Testament is we actually have several years of silence, about 400 years of silence, where God doesn't seem to say anything. He doesn't speak through prophets. He doesn't speak through other leaders at that time. Instead, God is silent because He's preparing what's to come next, and that, of course, is what's going to happen in the beginning of the New Testament, and that, of course, begins with the life of Jesus. Those first 4 books in the New Testament, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, tells us about the life of Christ, the things that He taught, the miracles that He performed, and of course ultimately about the death that He died and the resurrection that makes Him the King of Kings. After Jesus ascended back into heaven, though, that then left the apostles to carry out His work. And that's that next big book of the Bible, and that's that book of Acts. And that's where we read about the actions of the church, the early church as it was beginning. Peter, John, later there was Paul, and all of these other people began to help build Christ's church as it was ushering into the whole world. The remainder of the New Testament is very unique because it's letters. Letters that were written to Christians, both individually and Christians together as churches. All of those books like Romans and Thessalonians and even Revelation. And so, when you put all that together, that's the timeline of the Bible. And so now, let's see how well you can put all of those together. Now, moms and dads, you might want to use the pause button here or even the rewind button here if you need to, but I'm just going to go silent, and I'll just give you the opportunity over the next few seconds to try to work through these as we put them together. Here we go. Well, how did you do? Feel free to rewind, start it over, keep practicing that, and don't just remember the numbers that go along with the titles. Let's try to think about what those things mean and what stories fit into those specific categories. When we see how all that works together, we can just be amazed at what God has done in order to bring about salvation into this world so that we can one day live with Him in heaven. Thanks a bunch, guys.